Hi, I want to talk in this video about two Victorian writers, Alfred Lord Tennyson and Matthew Arnold. Now, Tennyson is really the premier Victorian poet. He was named poet laureate after the death of William Wordsworth. What he represents is a very dramatic shift in the direction of poetry. As you recall from the Romantics, we talked about the notion of being expressive. That is, the poet, such as Wordsworth, talks about their own experiences, their own feelings, right? And they had a whole idea of poetry that, for instance, is expressed in Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, which shifted the direction of poetry onto the poet, so that the poet's experiences really become the subject of poetry. Well, with the Victorian writers in general, and Tennyson as well, that shifts back to the mimetic. Remember, mimetic refers to the idea of looking at the world and trying to repeat that in the poem. Okay. Also, with Tennyson in particular, you have a strong sense of Englishness, right? The idea that England at this point in the 19th century is the premier power in the world, right? And as such, there are, shall we say, good things and bad things. They see themselves, the English see themselves, the British see themselves as this kind of new modern Rome, right? And they look back at the classics, they look at the Romans and the Greeks. And indeed, for our purposes, our readings for Tennyson involve poems that directly connect to the Odyssey, Homer's second epic, right? And in the Odyssey, Ulysses, or Odysseus, as he's known in the ancient Greek, and his sailors, after 10 years of fighting in Troy, after the Trojan War is finished, they start to go back to Greece. They start to go home, but they can't get home because Odysseus has made Poseidon very angry. And since he controls the winds and the tides on the ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea, I should say, there's no getting home. And so they wander for another 10 years. And I think that's very important to think about as the backdrop to The Lotus Eaters, which is taken from a relatively brief passage out of Homer's Odyssey, in which they land on an island and sailors are offered the lotus. First one's always free. And those who partake of the lotus, they get basically, well, we would say stoned or something like that, high. Basically what they really do is they feel released from the burdens that they have, and they no longer wish to continue. They have been wandering and wandering and wandering for no good reason, according to them. This is the argument for checking out. This is the argument for saying, I'm done. And these sailors do not want to go back onto the ship. They do not want to join Ulysses in his trip back to Greece. They want to stay where they are. They have found their particular version of Valhalla, right? Their paradise. And they want to go back no more. We will return no more. Right? And in this, you can kind of see the argument, if you will, of how hard life can be and to what point. Now, keep in mind, of course, Tennyson is writing from a Christian perspective, and the ancient Greeks were not Christians, obviously. And there's some allusions to some of that. But what you really need to know is the Old Testament. Garden of Eden. As I always like to say, it goes back to the Garden of Eden, in which Adam and Eve are cast out after disobeying God and eating from the tree. Not an apple tree, by the way. Everybody says an apple tree. It's not an apple tree. Never says apple tree. But the point is they're cast out. And Adam is cursed. Eve is cursed. She's got her own curse. The snake gets its own curse. But Adam's particular curse is that nothing will come to him but by the sweat of his brow, that he will have to work and toil to eat, to survive. There will always, always be work. That's his curse. And here, the sailors believe they're getting out of it. Should life all labor be? Is one thing that they say. Should life all labor be? As if the only reason to be alive was to work. Seems kind of pointless to them. The second poem is called Ulysses. Okay? And we can imagine that this is what happens after the end of the Odyssey. If you don't know the Odyssey, sorry, spoiler alert here. It's only been around for a few thousand years. You should know it by now. Ulysses, Odysseus, gets back to Ithaca, kills all the suitors who have been robbing him of his wealth, is reunited with his wife Penelope. That's great. It's a beautiful ending. I mean, forget about the dead bodies, right? It's like the fitting ending to the Odyssey. He's finally reunited with his wife and his son, and all is good. What happens the next day? Now, we're kind of used to this Disney, and they lived happily ever after. But Tennyson's asking the question, did they really live happily ever after? If you're Ulysses and you have been doing what you've been doing for the last 20 years, can you really just stop and settle down? Can you really just kind of go back to the humdrum of being just a king without a war, right? Where you just kind of sit there and decide on the rules of the day and listen to the budget talks and the subcommittee on subcommittees, etc., etc., etc. Ulysses says no. He wants to live life to the fullest, to use a cliche, right? He cannot stop. He has to go. He wants to get the band back together, right? All the sailors who were with him, and sail out to the west, the setting sun, to find out what's out there. It's kind of the opposite of the Lotus Eaters, right? It's kind of the flip side of it. Then the Lotus Eaters, they're talking about trying to get away from it all, to stop having to work for everything, for every single day being so dang freaking hard. Ulysses, on the other hand, says, no, I got to keep moving. I can't stop. As if life piled upon life were enough. Now, just a few words on Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold, in many ways, is remembered a lot more for what he did in the field of education. But we have one poem by him, right? He's an educational reformer, and he's very important if you ever get into that. If you're interested in becoming a teacher, something of that nature, you may come across Matthew Arnold's ideas. But this poem, Dover Beach, is a very interesting and I think very important poem. And it also starts to darken things just a little bit. Right? Dover Beach is about loss. Now, what is Dover Beach? If you're not familiar, Dover Beach is a real place in England, the point closest to France. Historically, it was the place where invasions of France or French invading English would take place. And it is quite literally, where these great walls, you can You can Google it, right? These huge, huge white walls. If you're familiar with Shakespeare, King Lear, right? At one point, the Duke of Gloucester goes to Dover Beach because he wants to kill himself by jumping off the edge of the cliffs of Dover, the white cliffs of Dover. Don't worry, I won't spoil what happens. But Dover Beach takes on the perspective of a man, perhaps, talking, looking out a window to a lover, perhaps. The idea of sadness. He talks about the eternal note of sadness. There's a sense of loss. And he uses the metaphor of tides. And the tide going out, exposing all the shells on the beach. Okay? And he sees this as a metaphor for loss. Loss of what? Loss of faith, a unifying faith. Remember, we said that in the Victorian era, as quite frankly, since the beginning of the semesters, Romantics too, religion is becoming more problematic. Scientific advances are making questions of religious belief. Religious beliefs have also highly fractured, right? Whereas, for instance, in the time before the Protestant Reformation, there was basically one central belief, basically throughout Europe, right, of Christianity, Catholicism. But after Martin Luther, right, there is what's called the Protestant Reformation. Now, not to get too into that part. The point, though, is as we move into the age of science, enlightenment, industrialization, things of that nature, and you should, again, look at the video that talks about this that I have just for Victorian. Arnold supremely feels this as a loss. The sea of faith was once too at the full, but now it's not. And what has taken its place is not reassuring. Right? This, in some ways, really kind of starts the theme that we'll see in Hardy and then in Yeats and later writers after that, of course, in the 20th century, where it's not only questioning tenets of faith, but faith itself. And what is there to take its place? The lines that close Dover Beach are particularly powerful. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. And I think your editors do you a disservice when they put in the footnote to say what particular battle and what particular war and what particular year and date he might be talking about. It's a metaphor, for crying out loud. Our struggle in the dark. We don't even know what we're fighting, who we're fighting, why we're fighting. And maybe there is no really good answer. That's the problem.